You're listening to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I'm your host, Rick Crawford. In this episode, I interview Moldy Chum's Brian Bennett, and we discuss everything from the history of Moldy Chum, his involvement with the Wild Steelhead Coalition, political activism to affect positive change, and the launch of his new podcast, Real Pure Radio, that'll go live next week. Hope you enjoy. This episode of the Sustainable Angler Podcast is brought to you by Emerger Strategies, helping our customers to increase their growth while improving the environmental performance of their operations and products. Profit sustainably. So, welcome to the Sustainable Angler Podcast. I have today is my guest, Brian Bennett, who, I think it's even better. I know, obviously, Moldy Chum. I know that you've worked for Patagonia, but it might just be even better to just let you run with that. And Brian, tell the people, who are you?
Yeah, well, you touched on a little bit of it. Right now, I am kind of Moldy Chum. So, yeah, Brian Bennett. I'm the CEO, the CFO, the founder, president, chief bottle washer of Moldy Chum, and that's my primary focus right now. As you mentioned, I worked for Patagonia for almost 14 years. I've kind of been in the combination of the bicycling and the outdoor industry, including the fishing industry, since, I'm going to date myself here, since the late 80s.
Okay.
So I've kind of always been on the outdoor side of things, career-wise. I mean, most recently, I'm actually a social worker by education. But I determined, and I kind of got into the sales role because sales is kind of really social work. It's, dynamics and relationships and all those kind of things. So,
right.
But I've been, my primary focus right now is on the Moldy Chum thing. And then on the side, I'm also on the board of directors of the Wild Steelhead Coalition here in Washington State. And so I'm kind of on my third term at this point. So one of my principal focuses personally is on wild steelhead. And as anybody who is a member of the Chum Nation knows that we put a great emphasis on conservation issues and taking action on that kind of stuff. So, there's the connection to, being here on the show with you today. So looking forward to talking.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Brian, we were actually first introduced originally by the old Tater, the Steve Tater Chuck, who's a great guy. And, we had just he was just like, hey, I think you guys would probably have a lot to talk about. And we had a really interesting conversation. And part of that was talking about Wild Steelhead Coalition. And, I'm based in Charleston, South Carolina. And as much as I would love to, I've actually never even attempted to steelhead fish. But I know that it's an amazing fish. I know that they're difficult to catch. But also just from what I've watched through movies and just sort of being a fly angler over the years is, what a journey that they take along with salmon and everything else. But, can you elaborate a little bit more on sort of what the Wild Steelhead Coalition, what their mission is and what y'all are hoping to achieve?
Yeah, sure. Two quick things. One is, there is that, it's the fish of 1,000 casts, kind of the musky similar thing. And one thing I would say is that steelhead aren't actually hard to catch. They're hard to find. And so if you get to places where there's still abundance of steelhead, they're quite a bit easier to catch than trying to catch them in some places where, populations have declined. So, and I learned that firsthand. I swung for steelhead, I don't know how many times, and never touched a fish. And then went up to British Columbia and fished with some friends. And within 30 minutes, I swung up my first steelhead. So
wow.
It's still not a numbers game for sure, but there is that perception. So the Wild Steelhead Coalition, it's a great group. It is a all volunteer organization. So it's run by a board of directors, and it's broad spectrum of people, folks in media, other folks involved in various conservation efforts. Jonathan Stump, who is a chairman of our board, works for American Rivers, for example. Chase Scannell, who's on our board, works for Conservation Northwest. So it's a pretty robust group of guys that are really dedicated to returning wild steelhead runs to not only just the Pacific Northwest, but the entire West Coast. And that's our focus. And there's a lot of other great groups doing steelhead work. Wild Fish Conservancy, Native Fish Society, Trout Unlimited's Wild Steelheaders United group, which is kind of a subset of TU. What we like to say is the Wild Steelhead Coalition, and we're 100% focused on steelhead. Mm-hmm. And we're nimble. We're a small group. We're not burdened by, having to raise money for operational costs. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we don't have full-time development directors and those kind of things. So we tend to operate, at a much kind of smaller level. But our goal is we try to build coalitions. We give out grants to graduate students to do steelhead research. We get involved in various campaigns and rulemaking. Anything that we can do to help achieve that mission of restoring wild steelhead runs, we tend to get involved in. We've had some great successes over the years. We were one of the original groups to really advocate for no more wild steelhead kill in the state of Washington. And, years ago, that rules proposal was put forth, and then it was pulled back on because the city of Forks, which is in the heart of the kind of steelhead zone on the Olympic Peninsula, threatened to sue the federal government around that rule change. But ultimately, over time, the state finally recognized that was going to be that the change needed to be made. And so I think it's 2 years ago now, we were instrumental, along with those other organizations, to stop wild kill here in the state of Washington, primarily on the Olympic Peninsula. So that was a huge victory for us.
That's awesome.
So, it's been, I think I'm pushing 9 years on the board now. And it's one of the most rewarding things that I do, and it brings me in touch with a community of people here in the Pacific Northwest that is really fun to work with and really fun to hang out with. The other thing I would say is that that if you look at the Pacific Northwest, it is ground zero for a lot of that type of conservation work as it relates to anadromous fish. Like, you look at the organizations here, you look at kind of when events get put on, who shows up at those kind of things. It's kind of a who's who of the conservation community around those kind of major issues that are happening out there around the decline of steelhead and salmon, for example. So it's a fun place to be in that respect in terms of the energy and the work that gets done. And conversely, too, it sometimes can be, as I like to say, like stepping on rakes, because you're constantly getting smacked in the face against, the policies and some of the decisions that get made that kind of work against, all the hard work that you're doing. So, but you've probably heard that story from a lot of people.
Sure. And I mean, I think it's great, and I'm all for, you talk about, so wild steelhead, right? So a wild, and when we had initially talked, you had mentioned the film Artificial, and I know that we've had a conversation about that. Actually, because of our conversation, I brought it to Charleston, and we did a viewing at Flood Tide Company at their office, and it was awesome because we're here in the Southeast, right? I mean, a large majority of the people here are never going to go steelhead fishing. But that was just not that film was completely about steelhead at all, but just more of the interest and wanting to get involved and how can we help? And I didn't know that hatcheries did this. It was a fascinating way to bring up an interesting topic here in the Southeast. And, I appreciate you bringing that film to my attention, because it really wasn't on my radar until after us having discussed that, and really interesting film.
Well, and you raise a really interesting point that we deal with on the Wild Steelhead Coalition board, and I think in general, and that is, how do we get anglers across the spectrum to help care for those fish that they may not ever have a connection to?
Right.
So, you look at groups like Bonefish Tarpon Trust who, do global efforts around trying to preserve bonefish and tarpon and permit. And you look at, and the term that I use is charismatic megafauna. And,
okay.
And so, it's like, why do people give money to save polar bears, right? And grizzly bears and orcas? And that's another whole story that's going on here. You saw it in the artificial film where, the awareness around the threats to salmon and consequently steelhead around the whole subject of, the resident killer whales here in Puget Sound. All of a sudden, everybody's like, we've got to save the salmon because we have to save the orcas, right?
Yep.
Because orcas represent that charismatic megafauna kind of iconic thing that people want to save. Right. Whereas steelhead, if you've never caught one or seen one, you don't have that connection. And that's one of the challenges, I think, around conservation, at least around steelhead, is that it tends to be an issue that is only addressed by anglers who fish for them. So how we can do that, not just with steelhead, to get other anglers to help take action to preserve wild steelhead. There's a lot going on with the whole striper conversation on the East Coast right now, with what's happening with stock status and, the Atlantic, Fisheries Marine Commission. The state commission is getting ready to put in some, fundamental changes. How do you get an angler who may have never fished for striped bass to like, hey, we're part of this community. We could use your help to, send a letter or to submit a comment or do whatever, because as a group, that as that you can create some political change as it relates to that. So, yeah, and artificial, you mentioned artificial. That's you look at some of these conversations, right? So we've got the whole question of salmon and steelhead, threats. And meanwhile, you have this whole scientific discussion around the benefit of hatcheries, and it almost becomes like it's a conversation that's like global climate change. You fall on one side or the other, per se, right?
Yeah. There's
some people in the middle. My feeling about all of that, for what it's worth, and I've lived in Seattle since 2001.
Okay.
By every single metric, what's been done to this point has been a failure. The metrics bear it out. There's been victories along the way for sure, and so at some point it's like, hey, you know what? Maybe we need to try to do things a little bit differently. And where can you kind of come to those agreements to maybe do those things? I'll give you an example. The state mandated a certain amount of wild steelhead gene banks, which was, certain rivers are going to be designated as gene banks strictly for wild steelhead, so there would be no hatchery influence on those rivers. And that plan has never even been fully implemented. And that plan is, I don't know when they came up with that plan originally, but it's been, I think, 8 to 10 years ago at least at this point. So there's been some movement. There was a group put together that we were very much a part of to kind of look at how that whole, steelhead hatchery management happens and building different portfolios and rivers. And I won't bore you with the details, but, there's been some movement. But, one of the things I've learned is that when it comes to this kind of, the fisheries issue, at least here, it's a slow process. biological opinions, and it takes years and years and years for things to happen. So I think with any conservation effort, whether it be steelhead or, redfish, where you guys are at, and you're looking at that, it's like, what you do today, lays the groundwork and the foundation for stuff that's not going to come to, may not come to fruition for 10 or 12 years and beyond. And so I think it's sometimes hard for, people to kind of wrap their head around that stuff because, in my particular case, a lot of the stuff that I'm working on, I probably won't be around to see it happen.
Right.
But I know that, generationally, I have a young daughter, and, beyond that is I want to be able to provide those opportunities to experience those fish, whether it's angling or some other way, that, generations in the future can enjoy. So that's what gives me hope in the fact that, what I'm doing now is going to, help that in the long run. But sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their heads around that, I think.
Well, yeah, and I agree. And you mentioned climate change, and that's
I didn't mean to laugh.
Yeah, right. That's just like, wow.
Yeah, the Amazon's on fire right now.
Right. So that'll help. So it's basically your lungs are on fire. Your lungs have lung cancer, and it's getting very aggressive. And while we're doing that, we're gonna light everything else on fire. But it's the same. That was a great analogy because it's the same thing, right? People have a hard time wrapping their head around, well, if we do this today and I'm not around to see the benefit, why do I care? And I think that, I have a 10-month-old, and I cared about this stuff beforehand, but now I'm like particularly driven by it. Because it's like, I want to have those experiences with her, and I want to be able to show her these things, and it's crazy to me. But that's just my opinion. It's just one person's opinion. But when you have the scientific data, it's just kind of like, I don't know what we're talking about here, guys. Like.
Well, and it comes down to abundance often, right? Like, this is one of my theories. Like, you look at it, and it's not really my theory, but so let's use Pebble as an example, which is in the news right now. And we have the Pebble Day of Action coming that AFTA pulled together here on the 24th, which is a couple days away. There's abundance up there. It's the largest salmon run left on the planet. It's like, yeah, we can all get along to agree that we need to fight this thing. But you get into places where you're fighting over limited resources, right? East Coast, red snapper, flounder, cod. Like you end up with conflict amongst groups that really should be getting along around it, because everybody has a different opinion about what they should get out of that resource. And so that's a challenge, right? How do you, it's like, hey, we're trying to, and even some of the conservation groups that I don't want to throw anybody under the bus, but, you look at, the American Sport Fishing Association and, their need to take conservation positions that benefit the business community, right? Because they are made up of, it's marine manufacturers and boat manufacturers and those kind of things. And they want to sell more boats and more motors and do all those things because it's the business of it. But, bottom line, when there's no more fish to catch, you don't have any business.
Exactly.
And as Chenard's, famous quote is, I don't think it's his, I don't know if it's his quote, but I think he often quotes, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but there's no business to be done on a dead planet, right? Yep. So it's kind of the same thing. And you see groups, that I think are, traditionally very conservation focused, taking political positions for whatever reasons around issues, the Magnuson-Stevens Modern Fish Act kind of dust up that happened, last year, where you kind of saw groups who were like, why are you taking this position against one of the best, restoration fisheries act that's ever happened, right? So it's always that thing. I mean, we deal with it here, the groups that are, the recreational angling community versus, which may tend to be a little less conservation minded in the minds of, the fly angling community per se, right? It's like, how do we crack that code and get everybody to kind of, work together for common cause? Now, my thing is, if you look at it, it's kind of like a Venn diagram. You're not going to agree on everything, but there's certain things that you really do agree upon. And that's those things, when you overlap those things, if you focus on those, I think you can really probably get more done. And it would be whether it's, within your own community or whether it's with First Nations. We have a lot of First Nations, differences of opinion around First Nations fisheries here. But there's a lot that we agree on. And even with artificial, there's been a lot of press lately about, from the tribes here, just, kind of saying, hey, we agree a lot about what's in this movie, but we don't agree with a lot of it. But the good thing is that you're starting a conversation around it. And that's what needs to happen in a lot of those cases of all those things that we've kind of been talking about. So,
well, I think it's part of it is, a couple things. I mean, one is the elephant in the room is population, right? I mean, growth. It's why we're having resource constraints. 10,000 years ago, when however many people inhabited the earth, I mean, you could pretty much do whatever you wanted. I mean, it's like you're not really going to affect the resource, but the more people, the more demand. So that's part of it, right? Because then you have all these people fighting over the same limited resource, and that's where you start running into conflict. But I think part of the solution is being just, I guess, an adult enough to just have a conversation, and you don't have to agree with everyone, but just be open to being like, okay, well, yeah. And like you said, I mean, find some common ground to be like, okay, well, look, I mean, what's beneficial for all of us? Like, is it better for us to exploit this to extinction, or should we work together towards a common goal and restore the resource? And I think that's another that I've sort of read articles about and things lately too, is using those types of words like restore and regenerative and those positive type words versus being like degradation. It's all, we're all going extinct and it's all degradation. I mean, that's just like, that's just going to turn some people off. But these people are, they're doomsdayers, and that's like the worst thing that can happen is to just be written off like that versus saying, well, no, we have this is an opportunity. The same, climate change is probably it is the biggest economic opportunity of my generation and of the 21st century. No doubt about it, solving that. And so when you frame it like that, it's like, oh, well, we can prosper by doing good for the environment. Okay, well, that's a very different message. And so I think messaging has a lot to do with it.
Well, yeah, and I mean, there's this whole, you look at this whole dust up with the Snake River Dams thing right now, and, there's a big push that it always has been to get those 4 lower Snake River Dams out, just those 4, for the benefit of, but now with the Orca scenario, it's like there's a bigger push, and you look at the competing interests, right? And, there's like, the cost to irrigators and all this other stuff, and there's all this mitigation. But nobody's looking at it as like, what would happen if there was a much healthier wild salmon run on the Columbia economically, right? I think it's that same thing. It's that short-term view versus the long-term benefit. And I think the other thing too is if you look at, over time, the science aspect of it. Right. So you see it on the east side, right? The East Coast, where people are like, well, the science says that these stocks are degraded, but I go out fishing and it doesn't look degraded to me. And so your science is wrong. And you're going, wait a second. No, not really. But if you look at like the global climate change thing that you brought up, 20 years ago, if you look at the percentage of people that looked at global climate change as like fact, I don't know the exact number, but if you compare it to where it's at today, it's declined dramatically, and that just has to do with the overall political discourse, I think. And so I think that that's driving a lot of that. Right? If you look at the amount of people that identified themselves as environmentalists 30 to 40 years ago, and I have a stat somewhere, I can dig it out, but it's dramatic how much people don't identify themselves as environmentalists anymore. And I think that still has to do with the kind of the messaging around a lot of that stuff as it relates to, you know, the industries that kind of benefit from all of that. So, yeah, I mean, it's like, yeah, doom and gloom, I suppose, but, you know, on the bright side, you know, there's groups like that group of kids that are working on the, you know, the climate change side of things. I mean, you can look at the Parkland thing and to completely get off a side subject there, but, you know, that's, you know, you look at, I mean, political advocacy and environmental advocacy is, that's going to be the roots of, you know, how things ultimately, you know, I think are going to change. I mean, myself personally, and people will tell you this, I'm a pitchforks and torches guy. You know, I mean, that's my thing. I don't, but the reality of that to some extent is, you know, it's a little bit harder to get things done per se because you're not really working, you know, collaboratively. It's like, this is the way I think should be. And there's people on both sides of that. But, you know, I think that you look at, you know, some of those, you know, but you need somebody who's got the pitchforks and the torches to kind of help raise the issues. And, you know, ultimately maybe those more sensible solutions, you know, now become, which may seem radical, don't seem so radical anymore. I mean, you know, I think Damnation, you know, the Patagonia film pointed that out dramatically in the fact that dam removal was not even in the conversation, 30, 40 years ago. And look at what's happening now, right? I mean, we're on the verge of the largest dam removal project in history on the Klamath. And that's just, you know, that's a fraction of the small deadhead dams that are coming out. I mean, I have an RSS feed for Moldy Chum for dam removal. There's 20 to 30 headlines daily that revolve around ongoing dam removal projects or proposed dam removal projects or people debating dam removal projects. I mean, it's amazing. So I think that you know, that kind of stuff is the reason why we need to be having these, you know, hard conversations around certain topics. And artificial brings up another one, you know, hatcheries. It's like, you know, should we blow up all hatcheries? I mean, I think theoretically I would advocate for that. Is it realistic? Probably not. But there's a lot of deadbeat hatcheries out there. And it's like, yeah, starting that conversation now, we'll be surprised where that conversation goes in 5, 6, 10 years from now. Right.
Yeah.
And yeah.
Well, yeah. And I was just going to say, I mean, to your point too, I mean, on the political advocacy side of this is you've got to, I mean, ultimately that's where the change happens, right? I mean, you know, of course, as individuals, you can make change, you know, make personal decisions. As businesses, as it relates to things like climate change, you can certainly make your own decisions to minimize your environmental impact. And but ultimately, what it comes down to is if we were all as individuals to call our elected officials and demand action on certain issues, it doesn't have to be climate change; it could be anything. But and demand action and work collaboratively together, that's where I think change can happen. And I also think that, you know, film is a great medium to get that conversation started, you know? And I think that's, I think it's what is, you know, if you care about things like wild steelhead or, you know, whatever it may be, your fishery, then you have a responsibility to defend it and let your elected officials know that it's important and that their job depends on it. Otherwise, nothing will change.
Yeah, it's funny. You know, that's a really good point. And it reminds me, well, two things. One is I've had the pleasure of going to Washington, D.C. this year twice as part of an Ocean Conservancy group to go lobby essentially for the preservation and the reauthorization of the Magnuson-Stevens Act.
Yep.
And gone with different constituencies, New England, Mid-Atlantic groups. I represented the West Coast, and Shane Anderson, who's made some great conservation films, came with us. And it's really, it's so exciting. I mean, you go through that process where you're sitting down with, I sat down with the entire Washington delegation, essentially, with their legislative aides, and talked about the importance of Magnuson-Stevens, thanked people that helped with beating back the threats to it. And then we had conversations around some other things, and it's amazing how much that engagement, not only kind of go, yeah, you feel like you're accomplishing something, but the other thing you realize is like, this is how the sausage is made, right?
Yep.
Like you go into the cafeteria in the House building or the Senate building, and you're in there with your group, and you look around, and there's like 20 people walking around with white canes, and they're all there to lobby for the American Disabilities Act. And there is a group of people that are clearly, police officers, and they're there lobbying for that's how it all happens. And clearly there is, if there's more money involved, you probably, you may actually get to meet with the actual congressman or senator as opposed to an aide. But, and I've been twice, and the conversations were similar each time, but with good follow-up and offers to be a resource. We've had those people reach back out to us and ask us questions about policy and things that are happening. So and you realize that you walk into a legislative office and there's two people sitting there, and all they're doing is answering the phone and looking and answering emails. And you realize that, and you've probably heard this before, when a congressional office gets 12 or 15 phone calls around an issue, they pay attention.
Right.
And so, yeah, we can accomplish a lot. And how do you, I do it on Moldy Chum all the time. It's like, take action for striped bass. Like I sent it wasn't a canned email. I wrote my own email about why I cared about striped bass to all the commissioners from Massachusetts, because I grew up there, and that constituency, the fact that I am a constituent, I go back every year, I spend money there, I'm in the business, and I made the argument as to why this was important to me. And you look at what happened, you heard the comments post the meeting that they had on August 8th, and everybody mentioned the amount of letters they received from people and how that really had an impact. So, but I care about stripers, and it's like, how do you mobilize that rapid response group that says, hey, we need you to take action on, this or that, and get people that's like, you know what, yeah, I may never see a striper, but I'm part of that angling community, and I need to support my fellow anglers, right, that care about this. It's like, and I'd love to be part of that solution. And there's some people doing some really good work, around that stuff, but it tends to be, kind of very regional and very, kind of species specific. And the second thing what you were talking about reminded me of a quote, and I'd love to dig it out. And maybe, I don't know if you do show notes on your show, but I'll dig it up. It's an old Moldy Chum post. I have a good friend, Sam Snyder, who's been, working on pebble mine issues up in Alaska for multiple different organizations. And he's written a lot of stuff around the history around conservation. And he made a comment that's like, you need, if you're not willing to get involved, get off the water. Like,
right.
If you're not willing, it's like you don't really deserve to kind of to get out there and to enjoy the benefits of all that if you're not going to fight to protect it. And it's one of the most powerful things I think that we've written, and one of the powerful things I've read. It's like, yeah, you have a mandate as a user of that resource to get out and to fight for it, whether it's and not just yours, because we're all part of that great community that we all love. So yeah, get after it.
Yeah, no, I love that. That's an awesome quote. And actually, and you kind of mentioned this earlier, but Pebble Mine, after.
Can I be honest with you about Pebble Mine?
Yeah.
I'm tired of it.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean,
I'm just like,
can we please stop this?
It's like, what? I mean, like, yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but it's just like, man, yeah. This is like, it's like a bad dream, Just keeps rearing its ugly head.
So as we're kind of having to laugh about this because it's so crazy that this is like back again, and you're like, oh my god. So and maybe this dates me, I don't know, but when I grew up, when I was growing up, there was this movie, Ernest Goes to Camp. And like, yeah. And the whole thing was like about fighting these developers that were going to come and like take over the camp and I don't even know what they were going to build. I just remembered that component, and it's like, it's like we're living in Ernest Goes to Camp with Pebble Mine. I'm just going to go ahead and say that. Like, this is like, stop. Like, no one wants this. Like, this is the people of Alaska have spoken. Anglers have spoken. I don't know how else to rewrite this.
Well, I think there's, one of the things that I feel, this was, I tend to lean on the left side of the political spectrum. I grew up in a home full of Kennedy Democrats. And I think the fundamental flaw that the Obama administration made around Pebble was they didn't put the 404, they waited till the end of his second term to submit the 404, basically. It was towards the tail end. And what they should have done was they should have taken the risky political position and done it sooner. It was the same thing about expanding Bears Ears, that, that decision was made at the very end of the administration. It was very easy for the current administration to unravel all of that. And I think that was the mistake they made on Pebble, is that it would have been, I guess, the Department of the Interior, right? It was, I can't remember her name, but after Sally, Jewel was the secretary, and EPA. Oh, actually, it was Gina McCarthy. It was EPA, so it wasn't Interior. Gina McCarthy should have pushed that through, early on, or Ken Salazar, I think, was prior. And I think it would have been much harder to unravel it. And I think the project may have died, a financial death, which it's kind of been doing all along, but it's just been lifeline after lifeline. They've lost all their partners, and now they've got an EPA and a Commerce Department that is going to greenlight that thing all the way, in my opinion. Yeah. So we'll see. There's other. Yeah, it's crazy, and you look at those threats. The Boundary Waters has got one going on right now. It's another one, right? It's another kind of foolhardy place to put another mine, right outside the BWCA. And those special interests are, very, very powerful. So it's tough. And you mentioned it. You've got an entire community, an entire industry united against this thing, and we've been pushing the rock up the hill for a lot of years. I was going to try to pull it up on my computer, but I've been doing Moldy Chum since 2005, and
yeah, I wanted to get into that too. So let's do some history there, because I've been a long time reader and everything else, but I would love to hear the story of how that all came to be.
Yeah, so it's pretty simple. I used to be involved in an outdoor industry website called the Piton, and it was kind of similar to the early Chum in that it was very much for lack of a better term, like I always used to describe the Chum as fly fishing meets the onion. Right. And we tried to be kind of tongue in cheek, and it was, we didn't, with cheeky headlines and funny pictures and those kind of things. Well, we had a site. I had a site that I shared with a dear friend, and what happened was my interest actually shifted. So I was always an outdoor industry guy. I didn't get into fishing until basically 2000.
Okay.
I never fished as a kid. Fishing as a kid for me was sitting on the dock with my grandfather, watching him, drink brown water, and then, swinging by the store and picking up a trout at the grocery store to bring home. Right. I didn't get it. And fortunately, I had a couple of people that kind of turned me on to it, and I went in with both feet. I mean, I think after I caught my first trout, I think I was 150 days on the water that year. Wow. And I basically gave up everything. I mean, I was a semi-pro bicycle racer. I was a climber. I did all of that. I gave up all of that to fit. Every free time I had, I was fishing. So because of my interest shift to fishing, and about the same time, interestingly enough, the Drake came out. Okay. And that was a real seismic shift in how fly fishing was presented. It was kind of like the Surfer's Journal of fishing. And that inspired me. And because I was, kind of not really new on the social media side, but the blogging thing was, really taking off at that point, I created it. And the kind of the way the history goes was it was all me. And then when I moved to Seattle, I partnered up with a guy named Eric Rathbun, who had a little brand called Real Pure. Okay. Which was this kind of same thing. It was like how to make fly fishing more, less tweed baggy, to use a bad term, and more kind of relevant and hip. And like, I've got some early discs that he did and kind of, videos that he did. It was like feeding time when the Drake put out that original video. I mean, that stuff was all at the forefront of everything that we see now. Yeah. And it's evolved over time. I mean, we've gone through 2 platforms. We went from Typepad to Squarespace. Now we're on WordPress. It was the wild, wild west too. I mean, the comments were just out of control, and, internet trolling, it all lived there. And then what happened was, this is kind of pre-Facebook, pre-Instagram. Okay. And so we've shifted a little bit in that, the way we used to present Moldy Chum is you can find tons of stuff on that, all on social media now. Mm-hmm. You look at the guys that that are, poking fun of the fly fishing industry at varying levels on Instagram. I mean, it's crazy. They're doing really, the fly fishing meme, right? Yep. Like we were doing caption contests before Instagram even existed. So the shift in social media that way has kind of really changed who we are in some respect. And the good news is that our engagement, the quality of our engagement is much better. The numbers that we have in engagement is not what it was back in the heyday. I mean, if you look at the stats back in the heyday, I mean, we were running 250,000 to 300,000 page views a month, wow. Easily. And now we're, not giving it away, but we're in the 6-figure zone right now. But if you look at how much time people spend on the site, you look at the quality of some of the comments that come through. I mean, we're not a forum. We don't generate a huge amount of comments. We screen every single one of them. It's much more robust in terms of how much people spend. The site's a little bit different. In the old days, you could just kind of scroll through it and see everything, kind of like a newsletter almost. Now, if you want to check out a story, you've got to click on the link. It takes you to another page. But we're doing some things, we hope. I am going to be at the IFTD show in October. Nice. I haven't been to one in a number of years just because trying to get to Florida and the whole scene was just kind of tough for me. But I'm going to, come out and deliver some media kits to some, brands and show kind of how we're evolving, the site even more moving forward. We don't, I know no disrespect to, people, it's like how to fish pocket water and product reviews and all that stuff. That's not who we are. That's not what we do. Yeah. Our thing is to try to be more kind of theater of the mind when it comes to those kind of things. The challenge is finding the time to do all that and to write it all and that stuff. And that's a bit of a challenge for us because, we have jobs and families and pets and things like that. But we're working on a couple of other projects too that we think will help kind of the entire portfolio. As we speak on a podcast, we have a new podcast that we are very, very close to launching, and be super stoked to share it with you. And because we think it's something that's a little bit different than what's out there right now. So,
are you able to share the name of it, or are y'all like still like pre-launch, or what's?
No, we're close. We're actually it's. The first episode's being uploaded. This is exclusive right now.
Oh, love it.
Yeah, so if you go to, the name of the show is Real Pure Radio, REEL. Okay. And that's the throwback to my original partnership at Real Pure.
Love it.
And it was funny, we had kicked around, like we went months trying to come up with a name. You know how that goes, right?
Yeah.
We were like, my partner at the time, Paul, was like, oh, Real Pure Radio. And we're like, that's it. And our first episode is called Chasing Shadows. And it's a story about, some of you probably know Brian Husky. But our podcast is very much theater of the mind. It's highly produced. It's recorded, live in places. For lack of a better analogy, it would be fly fishing meets This American Life. So,
cool.
Will Atlas just put out a great podcast that was kind of very serial-like. I don't know if you got a chance to catch it. It was 6 episodes, I believe, and it was about a story that I remember posting about on Moldy Chum, actually. But a guy that went down on a DIY fishing trip down in Mexico and was never seen again.
Yep.
And so, it's our theme is kind of similar to that. Although, interestingly enough, Paul and I have been talking about doing this podcast. Like the first time we had a conversation, we discussed this concept. So it's been like 5-6 years in the making. The challenge is they're difficult to put out. The frequency is very tough.
Right.
Because there's a fair amount of writing and production value involved. And so the hard part, and I'm used to Moldy Chum where, I'm putting content up every day. And so, to put out one kind of meaty episode a month is probably our best case scenario. We're trying to tweak some thoughts around maybe doing a series of shorts. So where instead of doing, a full-length episode around one topic, we could break it up into 4 shorter ones, and we could put something out every week so that we would get that frequency and that engagement that we like. So, but super stoked. We're close. I mean, we literally, the website was getting updated for RSS stuff so that once we post the audio, the final audio from this first episode, it should be loading up into iTunes, and then you'll see the full media blitz going out. So there is an Instagram page. The other cool thing that we're doing with it is we have some really cool graphics that go along with it. So,
nice.
Each episode will have, a particular piece of art associated with it. And then each particular show will probably have a T-shirt, and we're just going to do it through Bonfire. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Bonfire, but essentially you can submit a graphic, and it's a third-party company, and it's kind of campaign-driven. So some of the proceeds will go to whatever cause. And this particular case, it'll be something to do around roosterfish or Baja or something that Husky's involved with. And you kind of commit to it, and 3 weeks later you get your shirt.
That's super cool.
It's super cool. It was funny. Digress for a second, but the Wild Steelhead Coalition, we did a Save Thompson Steelhead T-shirt via Bonfire, and we raised like close to $5,000 for that cause through the Bonfire thing. Yeah, it's super cool. So we've got a T-shirt with a cool graphic that's tequila, 10 weights, and tacos. So it's all about,
That's
with
awesome.
with a rooster fish background. So I'll send you that stuff. I don't know if you want to drop in the show notes or whatever, but yeah, we're stoked. And yeah, maybe there's some other, when we get it, we're going to do some stuff around conservation too at some point. And this is pretty relevant, I think, in terms of, like, you look at, I mean, we're having a conversation around conservation issues and those things, and you do a fantastic job with the people that do that. But where is kind of that audio where you're doing it kind of more of the theater of the mind type of stuff? Like, what are some of those stories behind those conservation efforts? Like, for example, we all know about the Pebble Mine, right? We talked about it earlier. It's like, you can't, like, everybody knows about it.
Right.
But who are the people, like, what are the stories behind that cause that nobody knows about, right?
Yeah.
Like, how do you create, I mean, we all have a connection to it. We want to get involved because of, but how can you help create some of those emotional attachments to those people fighting those conservation causes that make somebody who, for example, you mentioned, like, never fish for steelhead, but hey, I want to get involved in it because I heard something that made me make that emotional connection somehow, right?
Yep.
So, maybe a good segue in this whole conversation, just in terms of, so we're looking at that angle around kind of adding a conservation component to our overall Real Pure Radio channel, per se. And I got to give a shout out to Michael, who's our production guy. He does he has a bunch of podcasts under Truth and Legend, and they're kind of they're hunting and photography focused. So they do podcasts around sporting dogs. And if you're into sporting dogs, I mean, it's called Sporting Dog Talk. They do a really cool one called Wild and Exposed, which is wilderness photographers, like some of the best in the world, that share their trips out into the backcountry. So if anybody that's listening, I encourage you to go to Truth and Legend and check out a bunch of Michael's podcasts. They're really, really solid, really good. So, and as you know, I mean, you look at kind of that space right now. I mean, I don't know, we may have achieved peak podcast at this point. So, it might have been, it probably would have behooved us to get our podcast out, a year or two ago. But I think in the fly fishing space, it's still very much a kind of a new, genre per se, right? And, you look at what's going on with, Ranella and Meat Eater and those guys and the investments that are being made in that group. They're jumping into the angling community. I don't know if you saw that, but
I did,
they just came out. Yeah. So, super cool. So that's only going to help float all boats, I think, as those guys really drive that within, which I think is more, that hunting community that cares about angling is going to kind of get a bigger focus on the angling side, thanks to those guys.
Yeah, I agree. And that's super awesome. And so a couple of things that we've talked about that I do just want to sort of make sure that everyone knows. What Real Pure Radio, is that right? So is it realpureradio.com? Or is it can be found on Moldy Chum?
Yeah, so I'll have a banner ad going up on the Chum here very soon. It's realpureradio.com. The site is still password protected. So you can go to it and you'll see it and there'll be an image there, but it'll ask you for a password. So it's not live yet.
Okay.
I would expect probably within a week or so. I'm pushing it out. Like, I'm trying to, under promise and over deliver. I'm going to say within 7 days that it will be live, and you'll see there'll be a pretty hard push. I mean, it'll be up on, the Moldy Chum Facebook page. I'll have it up on Instagram. It has its own Instagram page. It'll have its own Facebook page. I think, and the thing is, like we talked about, I've been doing Moldy Chum since 2005. I mean, if I had $1 for every time somebody had come to me like, hey, can you help promote my video? Can you help me do this? Can you help me do that? I mean, I am really like, I'm going to go out and go, okay, I've never asked for anything from anybody. like, here's our new podcast. Please listen to it. Please subscribe. You know, we're really trying to build a community here. And also, I'm trying to help. I mean, we have 3 great sponsors on the first episode. It's, Sage, our friends at Sims, and our friends at Costa. So we've got 3 really, solid people helping us push it out there. And so I gotta, I'm going to make the pitch pretty hard. So if you don't go to realpure.com, you'll probably see it. And if you follow me at all on, any of my social channels, you'll know when it's live for sure.
Yeah, no, and I'm psyched to help y'all push that out too. I mean, I appreciate just the first conversation we had, Brian, was was just, we were just on the same sheet of music, and I know that you're totally genuine, and I think that this is awesome, and I'm happy to help promote that and share that with the tens of people that follow me. But
no, trust me, I don't sell yourself short. It's that's what I do. I mean, I've always done that. I pride myself on networking people and trying to help out as best I can. And so I'm always, anybody out there that has any questions about steelhead or conservation or social media or I spent a couple hours with a friend at a fly shop yesterday working on helping them on the social media side and just talking about I 14, 15 tons of experience as a rep. I was the Patagonia fly fishing sales manager. What could you do to kind of improve working with the staff and how staff can do things. And so always happy to help people out. You can find me at moldychum@gmail.com. That's my email address. I have no problem sharing that with people. And, if anybody, gives us a listen and wants to reach out and, make a comment, or more than happy to respond to that. So, yeah.
All right, cool. Well, before we sort of sign off, I have just a few rapid fire questions.
Oh, is this like the ESPN in the hot seat?
Yeah, kind of, but it's going to be way lamer than that. But it'll be, but just just some random questions, and I'll just try and just run through them real quick and see what kind of response I can get.
You got it.
All right. So let's start with favorite conservation nonprofit.
Well, I got to say Wild Steelhead Coalition. I mean, it's, passionate for me. I would say that, but I got a personal interest there, as you've heard. But my new one right now is I got to throw a plug out to the American Saltwater Guides Association.
Yeah.
I've had I've had a chance to hang out with Tony and John in DC, and the work that those guys are doing on saltwater and Magnuson and stripers and all of the above on the East Coast is really solid work. And their website, I mean, when it comes to education, taking action, all that stuff, those guys are my new faves right now.
Awesome. Yep. Awesome. Love it. So American Saltwater Guide Association, everyone, and also Wild Steelhead Coalition. So check those out. All right. Next is you're on a deserted island. So you're saltwater and you only have one fly to survive. What's it going to be?
Oh, man. Well, I mean, the first one that comes to mind, it would be chartreuse clouser. I mean,
right.
I mean, I kind of got to go there. If it was, I mean, but that's kind of like, well, of course, chartreuse clouser, right?
Yeah.
But I would say, depending on where the island is, spawning shrimp. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think actually I asked. I have to go back. I think I maybe like rework that question. I think I asked Oliver White that, and I think he's for bonefish, and that was his answer. I think was spawning shrimp.
I mean, I was fishing for permit down at ESV Lodge, and I was a permit rookie, you know, and we were we were fishing the standard stuff like squimp, like 10 squimp. And I'm like, and we just like we were like it was crazy like how many shots we had, but we couldn't get the permit date. And I was like, dude, I'm putting on the white spawning shrimp. And like my guy was like, no, senor, no. I was like, no, I'm putting the white on. Yeah, swim. So if it wasn't a white one, I'd fish a pink one probably, because that would probably. So, yeah,
that's awesome.
When did you have Oliver on?
That was the last one that I just released it like a month ago.
Should I miss? I'm in rarefied air here, aren't I?
Yeah. So, well, you know, like I said, there's literally, you know, tens of people that like and share. So you gotta. It may have been buried somewhere, but
we'll
yeah,
put it out once we go live with this one. We'll put it. We'll share the love. Yeah.
All right. Cool. I appreciate that.
So sorry. Favorite saltwater fly island spawning shrimp.
All right, spawning shrimp. Final answer. I think that is so far. I've heard from 2 reputable anglers that's a good saltwater one. So anyone taking notes there, probably a good fly to have in your quiver, I guess. All right, and then we'll say one more, and I am just making this up as I go. What could it be? What about okay, so you love to steelhead fish. What is your favorite steelhead rod reel combination? What have you?
Oh, that's a good one. It's funny. I'm not a super gear geek when it comes to steelhead. So back in the day, I got a loop multi setup.
Okay.
And that's the other thing, for years and years and years on Moldy Chum, it was like, I'm not one of those guys that like, I'm Moldy Chum, send me free shit,
Right.
So, but I was angling with a friend, Tim Pask, and he was pretty tight with the loop guys at the time. And so they sent me a loop multi setup, and that's what I fish for steelhead, pretty much exclusively. I mean, I have a couple other spay rods. I have a Sage spay rod, and I have actually a spay rod from the guys at Leland's that they actually gave me too when I was working the fly fishing beat for Patagonia. But yeah, it's nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. So yeah, that's my go-to rig, and I use it pretty much everywhere. So I literally just relined it for the first time last season.
That's killer.
Yeah, and I have to say too, as it relates to the steelhead thing, I mean, I had the opportunity to go to BC a bunch of times. Just again, Patagonia fly fishing sales manager, was able to parlay that into some prime steelhead trips. But the reality is, I fished the Olympic Peninsula or the Klickitat, or when the Skagit was open, the Skagit. But the combination of the frustration behind the conservation stuff and overcrowding, and to some extent you go, maybe I shouldn't be fishing for these fish, right? Because there's so few, right? But we do there's a kind of a fun steelhead group that gets out early in January, and it's a who's who, guys from the come from all over the country. And I hadn't been out a bunch. I just stopped fishing locally for steelhead. I just wouldn't do it anymore. But I got out and swung for a couple of days and didn't touch a fish. And that's all I wanted to do after those 2 days, was to go get a steelhead grab. And I think I fished a total of 8 days, swung for steelhead 8 days this year. And that was like 2 days on the Upper Queets. It was a bunch of days on the Skagit. And the last day of this year, I finally hooked a fish. Yeah. And didn't get it to hand, but had it for a while. And it's just, there's something about that grab, that swing, that grab on the swing, and the whole thing that is, for me, as a guy that started fishing late and actually learned how to fish in Colorado. So I'm kind of learned as a trout bum kind of guy. That steelhead thing, there's something about it, but my favorite fishery though is sea run cutthroat.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. I mean, it's the backyard fishery here, and it's super visual. It's, there's sea run cutthroat. So you kind of get that anadromous fish vibe going, inch for inch. They're pretty strong trout, right? Because they're sea runs. And, a 20 incher is like a unicorn.
Right.
If they got that big all the time, there'd be thousands and thousands of people here. But in all honesty, I love it because it's easy, it's accessible. You can tweak your gear. You're fishing, 5-weight, 4-weight, lightweight stuff, and it's super fun. And so that's kind of my new mojo now is the sea run cutthroat thing. But it's one of the best. It's like funny though. When I first moved here, it's like, hey, where do you go? It's like, forget it.
Yeah, just don't even worry about it. Don't even bother yourself.
No, off the beach. I mean, more fun in the boat, but you can just do it off a beach. And so like, hey, where do I go? The beach thing was nobody would tell you anywhere to go back in the day. Anyway, I digress.
Yeah, well, no, it's good it's also good to know that for anyone looking for some sea run cutties right off the beach.
I think it's if you think about it, the sea run cuts go from Northern California all the way up to Alaska. Right. So there's sea run cutthroats. So the whole, that's like one of the biggest anadromous fish runs on the planet.
Wow.
Right. And it's also, we are, talking about sustainability. It's one of the great conservation success stories in the state of Washington.
Oh, this is actually perfect. I'm sorry to interrupt you because I was going to say, I thought I was done, but I did want you to share a positive conservation or sustainability story. So this is perfect. So let's hear it.
There was a guy named Les Johnson who's an icon here in Washington. I didn't know Les. He's passed away. He wrote a great book on fly fishing for sea run cutthroat. He was instrumental in getting no harvest of sea run cutthroat. It is managed as a game fish. You cannot kill sea run cutthroat.
Wow.
And they've come back dramatically. And there's always been, I think, Oregon at one point in time pushed to kind of open up harvest on them again or a few other things. But I mean, it's managed as a game fish. So that's a great story. The other great story is the Wild Steelhead Coalition and the other groups that got involved to stop wild kill of wild steelhead in the state of Washington.
Yeah.
I mean, that was a big one. Moldy Chum, you kind of, one of the things that motivates me, and there's been a couple times where, we've been able to have an impact. And one of those times was when the Pike Place Market, which is the famous market in downtown Seattle, you've probably heard of, where they throw the fish.
Yeah. I've been there. Yep.
They were selling wild steelhead. Somebody sent us an email, had a photograph of it, and we posted it on Moldy Chum. We put the email link to where people could contact them, and they cried uncle within a day.
That's good.
They were like, wow, no, you made a mistake. So, and that happens a bit, in this area, if somebody tries to serve wild steelhead on the menu, the social media outcry is usually so robust. I mean, generally, most of that wild steelhead that gets harvested here, and it's still a harvested fish, gets sent to, Denver and Kansas City and Chicago because nobody really knows that, they shouldn't be eating wild steelhead. So, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But, yeah. So we've done that a few times. We've put stuff up where people have reacted to the point that people are like, who are you? What happened? I think there's a restaurant down in Malibu that was serving wild steelhead, and we posted something in the same thing. I actually got a phone call from the manager asking me to tell people to back off.
Please tell people to ease up on this.
Yeah. But I don't. know if we have that much pull anymore, but we try. And there isn't a day that goes by where we don't usually highlight some conservation story. I think today, as an example, we had, we usually post 4 new things a day, and we had a piece about the Pebble Mines overlooked port, which was a really good story from Hakai magazine. Like, everybody's focused on the damage of the mine, but like even Pebble's going, the environmental impact of the port is like alone bad enough to disqualify this whole project. And then we had a post as well about a report that the federal officials suppressed an environmental document that detailed how the administration's water plan was going to hurt California salmon, steelhead, and beyond. So, so every day, there usually doesn't a day go by where we hit on that. And I think that's one of the things that we, kind of try to, we do. And I think we've also, this is one of the takeaways, I think, and maybe a good place to wrap is, I remember when we started, there was only a couple of us back in 2005. There was Moldy Chum, Marshall at Midcurrent, and like Tom Chandler at the Trout Underground, and Lee Murdoch at Flyfish Magazine. I mean, we used to have a blogger party at the after show in Denver, and it was like 5 of us. And I remember, I think it was, I don't know if it was Louie or somebody at Gink and Gasoline did an interview with April on her podcast, and it basically said that Moldy Chum was the inspiration for them to start Gink and Gasoline. And you look at that, and I look at the conversation in social media around conservation and how people are focused on it. And I think we had a part in kind of inspiring people to focus more on that. And if there's one thing that I'm probably most proud of, is probably that, I would say. So,
well, I love that, and I've always sort of used the conservation side of y'all's website just as reference and just sort of a place to see what's happening. And so thank you for that. And really just want to thank you for your time. I appreciate everything that y'all have done. I'm psyched to hear the new podcasts, Real Pure Radio. And I am also really just appreciative of the work that you do with Wild Steelhead Coalition, as well as just taking time to talk with me, and not only for this podcast, but just other conversations. So just really appreciate it. And we will definitely talk some more, but I'll be out at IFTD. So would love to meet in person if you have time.
Absolutely. Let's plan on it. And I look forward, someday being on again and, maybe talking about a specific issue or something else, we can take it to the next level now that everybody knows me.
Right.
Look forward to that, Rick. I really do.
Thanks for tuning in to The Sustainable Angler. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, which is now available on Google Play Music, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, and SoundCloud. And visit emergerstrategies.com to learn more about our sustainability and marketing services.